Welcome to the Mo Show Live, everybody. Hey, I'm Morris Lilienthal. One of the things I'm real passionate about is motor vehicle safety. As a trial lawyer, I often see the sadness that results out of a motor vehicle crash. And to kind of give you just a little bit of a perspective, ladies and gentlemen, in 2017, just here in our state alone, according to statistics, there were over 157,000 motor vehicle crashes in Alabama, and over 48,000 injuries out of those crashes, and over 857 fatalities. So just staggering numbers just in our state alone, and for those watching in other states, it could be even more. The crashes that resulted in those injuries and accidents in 2017, a lot of those were preventable crashes or crashes where the injuries could have been minimized if the proper safety equipment had been used. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Our guest today is Alabama State Trooper Curtis Summerville. Trooper Summerville has a passion for informing and educating the public on motor vehicle safety, and so that's what we're going to talk about. So without further ado, let me formally introduce Trooper Summerville. Again, our guest today is Alabama State Trooper Curtis Summerville. He is the Public Information and Education Officer with ALA, which stands for the Alabama Law Enforcement Agency. He has been an Alabama State Trooper now, I think, for over 31 years. He is a native of Eutaw. Now, if you're from Pickens County, Alabama, where I live, that's a Eutaw with an E, folks, not with a U. Okay, so he's from Greene County, Alabama, which is a great area of the country, the state, Alabama. He's a graduate of Paramount High School. He also attended Alabama A&M and holds a degree in business management. He's also served our state and our country in the Alabama National Guard and has served in Afghanistan. Trooper Summerville, thank you so much for your time and for your service to our state and our country. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing well, Mo. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's my privilege, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be here and to talk to us and to share your knowledge and wisdom with us. Folks, if you're watching the show live, please comment with questions. Let us know you're watching. If you've got questions for Trooper Summerville about distracted driving, any Alabama laws, or just want feedback from a state trooper, not ways to get out of a ticket. We're not looking for that today. But if you've got real life questions you want to ask, and if you're watching the replay, feel free to put comments in there. We'll try to monitor the comments for the next few days, and we'll try to get you some feedback on those questions you may have. And the last thing I'd ask before we really jump into the questions and the conversation here is please like and share the show. You know, what the things that we're going to be talking about today affect so many lives, and if people would be better informed about these safety things that you can do to either prevent a crash or to minimize the impact of a crash, I think we can really help save a lot of lives and impact a lot of lives. So please like and share the show to help get the word out. The Trooper Summerville, I guess where I would start is where we all start with driving a car, which is we start driving, most of us, when we're 16, 17 years old, sometimes 15 if we get our permit. I think there are a lot of people out there that aren't aware of the graduated driver's license laws in our state. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and what the implication of that is and why they're in place?
Well, Mo, first of all, I like your terminology when you said that we're talking about crashes. Most folks refer to them as accidents. We in law enforcement don't refer to them as accidents because, you look at an accident as something that you cannot prevent. However, a crash can be preventable. So definitely like your terminology on that. Here's the thing with the graduated driver's license. Most of my days are spent educating kids in high schools and different venues. And one of the things I talk about when I talk to teenage drivers, primarily driver's ed classes, is that car crashes are the number one cause of death for teenagers. And oftentimes that's because they're inexperienced. And oftentimes they're out during times of night where maybe they can get a little bit into things they shouldn't be getting into because it's so late at night. So what we've done was we've created the graduated driver's license law, which is a national effort. And we have seen a reduction in teenage crashes and teenage fatalities since we've actually put this law into place. So we think it is working for us.
Well, one of the things that I saw that was pretty interesting to drive home, I saw some statistics, and I think it was on the Department of Public Safety's website or one of the related sites here in the state, was drivers 16 to 19, Trooper Summerville, were twice as likely to be in a crash as those aged 20 to 24, 3 times as likely to be in a crash as somebody who's 25 to 29, and 4 times as likely if you're 16 to 19 to be in a crash as somebody who's aged 30 to 69. So I think experience, there's a lot of things in life, teaches us a lot. And I think the graduate driver's license law really allows, I guess, young drivers to ease into the responsibility of driving.
Yeah, what it does is it's and like you say, those statistics are something, and oftentimes because of inexperience. But what the graduated driver's license does, it places certain restrictions on that brand new driver. Basically, when they get their permit at 15 years old, when you and I got our permit, Mo, if we were 15 and my birthday was tomorrow, I turned 16, well, guess what? I could go get my driver's license. But now they cannot do that. They're forced to hold that permit for about 6 months. And what this does, it forces their parents to spend more time with that child and teach that child a little bit better in terms of how to drive, the rules and regulations, the rules of the road, so to speak. So what it does, it gets them out there at 15, they ride with their parents, and they have to ride with a license, or should I say rather, an older driver or a driver instructor. When you and I got our permit, if I was 15, my buddy was 16 or 17, well, he was a licensed driver. He was considered a licensed driver, so I could drive that vehicle. Now they can't. That person has to be 21 years old or older. Let's face it, what are two 16 and 17-year-olds talking about? Nothing. Probably sports, girls, and other things, but they're certainly not talking about educating themselves on driving. So he has to be with an adult driver, and also once he turns, that's what we call the permit period. Right. The second phase is what we call the restricted period, and that's when that child turns 16. He actually gets that driver's license, and there are certain restrictions placed on him at that point in time in terms of the time of day that he can drive, or should I say the time of night that he can drive. He cannot drive between the hours of 12 midnight and 6 in the morning. Now, there are some exceptions. Those exceptions are if it's a school function, or there's some type of church activity, or the child may be working, or there may be an emergency. Then he can drive during those hours. But other than that, he or she has to be at home by 12. And certainly one of the other things, which is a good one, is they cannot have as many teenage passengers. They can only have one other teenage passenger unless they're accompanied by an adult or a parent. And sometimes those distractions, those are probably the number one reason that children get involved in crashes, along with their inattention. That their inattention is usually caused by the distraction, and sometimes having more than one other teenager in the car, they can't do that. Also, they're not allowed to actually talk on their cell phones at 16, which is another biggie for us. And then once they turn 17, they have full privileges like anybody else out there driving.
Well, I just think it's smart. It kind of eases them into that responsibility, As a lot of the things you talk about there are good common sense things that probably should have been there a long time ago, but we just didn't implement them, right? I mean, my college football coach used to tell us our weight coach used to tell us that nothing good happens after midnight. You just need to be on home. If you can't get it accomplished,
I think most parents feel the same way too.
Right, and so and then I think some of the statistics that I reviewed said more accidents are happening at night for teenage drivers. Yes. So that's why there's that cutoff and doing.
Yes.
And we're all prone to be distracted. And I want to talk to them about distracted driving in a minute. But at a younger age, our inattention can certainly, if there's other kids in the car, other friends in the car, the music's loud, or you're chit-chatting, or you're pointing out things, I can easily see where that can cause someone to lose attention. And, at 60 miles an hour, you're going, 88 feet a second?
Yes.
It doesn't take long to go real far when you take your eyes off the road for just a few seconds, folks.
And just to kind of piggyback on what you just said there, Mo, you consider, you're exactly right. At 60 miles per hour, you're traveling 88 feet per second. Let's just say it takes you 2 seconds to respond to a text you just got. Well, if it takes you 2 seconds to respond, that means 88 feet per second, but you're taking 2 seconds to respond. So 2 times 88 is 176. So that means you've driven 176 feet with your eyes looking down at your phone, and you weren't looking at the roadway. And this is how crashes often happen. People go through an intersection. They don't see the light change. They don't see that person standing there waiting to catch the bus. They don't see the person standing there at the mailbox. And it can happen so quickly. And I think most of the time people just don't realize the distance they're traveling. Most people, like when I tell high school kids that, they're like, really, I'm traveling that far in 2 seconds? They think it's only maybe 30, 45 feet or something like that. But no, I tell them, no, it's 176 feet. So that's quite a distance in just that limited time.
It is. And the other thing that some of your peers would tell you that are trained in accident reconstruction, and I'm certainly not trained, but I've deposed many of them. And what they'll tell you is that the average reaction times is 1.5 seconds. Mm-hmm. So then you add in another 1.5 seconds if you're distracted for 2 seconds. Mm-hmm. Then by the time you recognize a hazard and you can start to apply the brake or take an evasive maneuver, there's another 1.5 seconds.
Yes.
So now we're even further down the road.
Yes. Yeah, what you're referring to is like braking distance, and sometimes with that, if you add on to, give an example of something. If you're driving around 40 miles per hour and you're right at about 1.5 seconds of reaction time. Let's just say you're on your cell phone and you recognize that there's a danger in front of you. And when you see that danger, you got to take some type of corrective action. Well, that corrective action may be to take your foot off the accelerator, apply the brakes, and maybe swerve. Well, you can do that in 1.5 seconds and you do it. Well, let's just say you have something in your hand, such as a cell phone. And so instead of 1.5 seconds, you now maybe move to maybe 1.7 seconds. And that's only a fraction of the blink of an eye, but that distance will actually add about 3 car lengths to your stopping distance. So in terms of where you would have stopped had you not been texting, you can now get 3 cars in that space. So you think about that, if you get 3 cars in between, and that may be the distance between life and death, or certainly a serious injury for somebody.
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. Real quick, I want to thank some people for joining us. Will Alexander, our mutual friend Caleb Ballou, who hooked me up with you. Thanks, Caleb. Timothy Kilpatrick, Barney Lowry. Thank you guys for joining us. If you got questions, please let us know. That kind of dovetails into a big topic that's kind of a hot button issue in the last couple of years, and one that is distracted driving, and specifically narrowed down to texting and driving. I can tell you that I don't think I don't make a trip more than a mile or two down the road, and I don't see somebody that's got their hand above the steering wheel, or they're like this, Trooper Summerville, their heads down below in their lap, because I know they're texting. And, something that I think has been a pretty prevalent statistic we've heard a lot in the recent years is that you're 23 times more likely to be involved in a crash if you're texting and driving than someone who isn't. That's scary. What can we do as a society? It feels like we're trying to push the education. What can we do, either education-wise and/or enforcement-wise, with officers like yourself, to try to really curtail this really problem issue that we're seeing out there? Because it's not going anywhere. People are continuing. We're so prevalent, relying upon our cell phone and technology.
Well, you talk about certainly education and enforcement, but there has to be a technology aspect involved. There are some phones where you can set the phone up, and certain apps you can buy that if your car is in motion, your phone won't be able to actually receive or text, or you can't send a text. I would encourage every parent to actually look in getting some type of app like that, and certainly putting it on their child's phone. And if you're a person who just can't control yourself as an adult, maybe you should put it on your phone also. But I think you have to really, really educate yourself in terms of what happened. I think just knowing and getting out there, letting people know, because people don't understand it, the dynamics of a vehicle and what's occurring with the vehicle, because we drive every day, and it becomes such a everyday part of our life, getting behind the wheel of that vehicle. We really sometimes don't put a lot of emphasis on safety, and we just I was listening to a study today, and some people say that 94% of people believe they're good drivers. And so if you have people out there that's believing that, and they're actually texting and driving, they feel that I can do this. And people like to refer, I can multitask. There's no such thing as multitasking. Your brain can literally only focus on one thing at a time. So you're doing lots of activities. That's what you're doing, but you're not necessarily multitasking. So definitely for parents, my suggestion would be, be an example. I always talk about being an example. If you don't want your children to text and drive, then don't you text and drive. If you don't want your children to drink and drive, then don't you drink and drive. Those things you don't, because children are actually mimicking their parents. I mean, we often look at it, this growing up, we look at our parents. And if your parents think it's okay to text and drive, then guess what? That child's going to think it's okay to text and drive. You certainly got to inform children once they leave that door, go outside. Just like if it's wintertime, you tell your children to put on their coat, to put a hat on their head if it's raining or something. You have to tell your child every time they step out of the door, you got to reinforce that. We always hear repetition, say it over and over again. Don't text and drive. And somewhere, believe it or not, even though we don't think our children are listening, they are listening.
Well, I love that so much, because that was a point I wanted to make a little later, and I'm glad you went ahead and brought it up, is because I think that applies to texting and driving, drinking and driving, and something else I want to get to in a few minutes is buckling up. And our kids are emulating us, and I've got an 8-year-old, Trooper Summerville, and it amazes me that I'll say something in passing, and by gosh, yes. I don't mean maybe the next day, but weeks later, it comes back to haunt me. And I didn't think he was paying attention or doing, and he is paying attention to every word. But I can assure you, he does not get into a vehicle unless he's buckled up. He'll tell you, don't move because I'm not finished buckling up, because that's how we have trained him in doing. That's what he's used to. But that's what, in terms of texting and driving, if they see you driving down the road holding this thing, folks, your kids are going to think that's okay. They're going to think that's acceptable behavior.
Exactly.
But I can tell you that over the years, I have seen too many victims of texting and driving accidents, and families that have lost loved ones to this over a silly text that could have waited. And I think if the more education we can get out and have victims to really tell their stories, as tough as it may be, we've got some really brave people that are out there doing that I think it's really helpful. We had David Little here, who was joined us and said he's glad to see us talking about distracted driving, and said we were exactly right. You were exactly right about the multitasking myth, that you can multitask. In fact, I know I've got some other friends, lawyer friends of mine that really believe that even Bluetooth and those kind of things are still very dangerous. That maybe it's a little safer, but we're still distracted because we're thinking about talking on the phone, and whatever we're talking to our spouse or our friend about, that's taking us away. Do you think any new laws, such as the proposed hands-free law, would be any help? I know there's been a proposition of doing that, coming into that, like a similar law in Georgia, where you can't hold your phone at all and receive.
We certainly over in ALEA, we're not opposed to any laws that may actually help us in terms of safety. I think that's a law. It's kind of a wait and see situation. I don't know would it be helpful or not, but certainly, if our legislators, our folks that put the laws in place, they feel that, we in ALEA certainly appreciate any suggestions they have concerning safety, and we'll get out and enforce those laws once they put them in place. Georgia's kind of a trial state because they're going through that now. I think we can kind of wait and see, kind of maybe a year or two on their statistics, and just see how it goes with them.
Talk to me a minute about that, because something in terms of enforcement, as best as you can give us kind of a basic understanding of what, as a trooper, and what under the Alabama current law against texting and driving, what are you allowed to do when you pull them over or cite them for that? How does that work? Because I know I've had other people say, well, I see people doing it and they're not enforcing it. But so what can you do to enforce it right under the current law?
Well, first of all, you can be ticketed for that. Okay. Let me tell you what the law says. The law says you cannot read, write, or send a text message when that vehicle is in motion on a public roadway. So, and I think a lot of people misconstrue that because they believe if they get to a traffic light and traffic is stopped, I can take a second to kind of look at my phone. You cannot do that. Remember, you cannot read, write, or send a text message on a public roadway. So that means if a police officer actually sees you at an intersection or stopped at a stop sign and you're looking at your phone, you're not texting, you're simply looking at your phone, then actually you could get in trouble under the texting and driving law, and you could be cited for it. Then let me also say this: you cannot set your GPS while the vehicle is in motion. If looking at your GPS and setting it is it's two different things. So if someone is giving you an address and you're listening, you're kind of trying to program that address while the car is in motion, then it also applies. It's something that I often have to clear up with children because they believe they can actually play video games while the car's in motion. So I have to always encourage them and tell them that no, video games also fall under the texting and driving rule. In other words, you cannot play a video game while the car's in motion and you're behind the wheel. So we have to, and surprisingly, we have to tell children that because that doesn't mean I'm texting. I say anything you're doing, reading an email, actually falls up under the texting and driving law. So you cannot do it behind the wheel of your vehicle. But again, you can be cited for that. We can give you tickets for that. And believe it or not, we're doing that here in Alabama as much as we can. Troopers, we get out, and there's so many laws to enforce, but whenever we can enforce that, because we know it's a problem, and so we try to get out as much as we can and educate the public about that law.
Yeah, I agree, and it's just like I said, every time you get in the car, it's so prevalent, and technology is great, but I think education and maybe technology in and of itself can help us curtail this issue by having apps or things that are there that when you crank up and it tells your phone essentially goes inactive while your car is in motion. Because I know that, for example, the Waze app that gives you navigation and does tell you where the police are. But if you're moving, it asks if you're a passenger. Now, that's good that it detects that, but you can easily put passenger and then go ahead and start typing and doing that in there, so it's not foolproof. But I guess the other thing real quick with distracted driving is to kind of let everybody know, Trooper Summerville, that we're not just talking about the phone. And I know that we were talking about this with teenage drivers, with others in the vehicle, but I've had several accidents too that I come to mind right now in the last couple of years with fatalities where people were distracted, in these cases, by children in the car. And as a parent, I know that's tough because I want to turn back, hand a sippy cup, hand them a snack, or soothe them with a pat. And it's just the same thing that we're talking about, right?
Yes, and I'm glad you brought up that point because it's not just phone. There's so many distractions. Inside distractions, in other words, distraction inside your vehicle are probably the biggest distraction that most people face, but there are also outside of distraction. People are looking at things that are going on around them. I mean, there's construction. You may be looking at construction. There may be a nice car or a nice vehicle or a nice person you're looking at, but there's just something you're looking at that's going on. Billboards. People are actually reading billboards going on the road. People are reading bumper stickers on other people's cars. So there's so many things that you could be distracted distracted by that, you really need to focus on what you're doing. And we ride across the state of Alabama, and certainly we have a beautiful state. There's so many things to look at in terms of what nature has to offer this state. And sometimes we can get caught up in looking at those things and really just not paying attention to what we're going. And not only that, just things you could be doing as a person, maybe putting on makeup, or reading. And I'll tell you a strange story. Believe it or not, I actually physically saw this. I saw a gentleman going down the interstate. He was shaving, not with an electric razor. He literally had shaving cream on his face, shaving while his vehicle was in motion. So those are also distractions. No one would ever believe someone would do that. But again, there are so many different distractions.
There are. And yeah, just folks, what I would take from that is just be cognizant of that. Just because you're not texting and driving doesn't mean you can't be distracted by something else. So be mindful of that because as we said earlier, at 60 miles an hour, you're going 88 feet a second. Be mindful that if you take your eyes off the road for whatever reason, whether it's your child in the back seat, whether it's to pick up your Big Mac, whether it's to look off at something outside of the vehicle that's not in front of you, you are putting your life and the life of somebody else in front of you in danger. Because give you a perfect example, and I was giving you this example earlier, Trooper Summerville was a case that I just resolved where someone was actually distracted by a state trooper on the side of the road, and it ended up causing a wreck in front of them. But that brings up a point that I know you wanted to touch on. Can you tell our audience a little bit about the move over law and what that is and how that adds safety and how drivers should adhere to the move over law and all that?
Yeah, the move over law was actually put in place to provide a little bit more safety for your emergency responders if they're responding to some type of emergency along the interstate, and not just the interstate. It could be a 2-lane road, but you are required, if you're in what we typically refer to as the outside lane. And naturally, when we stop people, we try as best as we can to stop them on the right-hand side of the road. So if you see an emergency vehicle such as a police officer, a fire truck, an ambulance, even a wrecker, if they're performing some type of emergency activity on the side of the road, and you're in that outside lane, you're required to vacate that lane and move to the inside lane as best as you can. Now, if certainly the traffic is so high, sometimes you just really can't get over. If you cannot get over, you are to slow down to 15 miles below the posted speed limit. So in other words, if you're doing 70 miles per hour, you have to slow down to 55 miles per hour. Because sometimes, a couple of years ago, I was on the interstate and it was during the 4th of July and traffic was just so heavy, there was no way people could get over. Traffic was literally that heavy. So you are required to just slow down if you can't pull over. And again, this is for the safety of a lot of law enforcement officers. Most of your law enforcement officers that are either injured in the line of duty or killed in the line of duty, believe it or not, is traffic related. Either they're hit by cars or they're involved in some type of crash. So this is certainly for us in that first responder, as well as the people that we may be helping on that in terms of whether we're writing a citation, whether we're changing a flat tire for somebody. So it also provides a level of safety for them also.
Yeah, just keep that in mind, folks, and realize I knew you were supposed to slow down. I didn't know it was 15 under the speed limit if you can't get over. But just keep in mind, as you're paying attention to what's going on in front of you, if you see an emergency vehicle off to the shoulder with its lights activated, then if you're on a 4-lane highway, you need to merge over as soon and safely as possible as you can. It's just for the safety of the officer and the safety of the person that they're helping or working on that thing. Folks, if you're just joining us, our guest today on the Mo Show Live is Alabama State Trooper Curtis Summerville. We're talking about driving safety tips, the Alabama driver's graduated license law. We've been talking about distracted driving. And now the next topic I want to talk about is something that you would think in 2019 we really wouldn't be talking about, but that's buckling up. I kind of thought about it when I was thinking about topics to talk about, and it was kind of like, we all know smoking's dangerous, but a lot of people are still smoking. We all know that you should buckle up, and it gives you a chance to be safer. But talk a little bit about that. I know in my practice, and I've got to think out in the field, you and your fellow troopers are seeing a lot of people that aren't buckling up still.
Yeah, let's go on a little bit of a history lesson. Back when we started, the law came into place that you were required to wear seatbelts in the state of Alabama. Seatbelt usage in the state was somewhere around 57, 58%. Right now, we're probably somewhere at 85%. So you look at it, we have improved just a little bit. But let me say this also. Approximately 70% of the fatal crashes that we investigate, these people are not wearing seatbelts. So if you look at that comes from, if I say 85% of the folks are wearing seatbelts, that means 15% of the folks are not wearing seatbelts. Well, guess what? That small number of people, 15%, they make up for 70% of the fatal crashes in the state of Alabama. So you can see right there that it's so important that you put a seatbelt on. I've been doing this for a while, as you said, a trooper for 31 years, and I can personally tell you in in my career in terms of the fatal crashes I worked. And I promise you could probably talk to any trooper throughout the state, and they will probably echo the same sentiments. About 70% of the fatal crashes I have personally worked myself. In my opinion, those folks could have walked away had they just simply had a seatbelt on. Something as simple as a seatbelt could have saved that life. And so you're right. And I do press releases. So whenever there's a fatal crash, I have to put out a press release and give that press release to the media. And oftentimes when I'm doing my press releases, I always note that this person doesn't have a seatbelt on. And I keep hearing over in my mind, I'm telling people, we're getting out, we're educating people, we're enforcing this law, but yet and still people are not wearing seatbelts. And some of the excuses, I just heard a gentleman literally yesterday tell me that the reason he doesn't wear a seatbelt because when he was a teenager, and I believe he was somewhere around 52, I remember, he told me that when he was a teenager, he was in a car crash and he believed that had he had his seatbelt on, he would have been killed. And that was his excuse for not wearing a seatbelt. And I told him, sir, that's the exception. That's not the norm. 9 times out of 10, if you have that seatbelt, it's going to save your life. So oftentimes people will go with that exception as opposed to what's the norm, and they have in their mind that they're not supposed to wear that seat. But I can promise you that's the safest thing you can do when you get in that vehicle is to put that seatbelt on. That's the number one thing, because you can only be responsible for yourself. You can't be responsible for what other folks are doing out there. So that's the safest thing you can do is to put that seatbelt on.
That's right, folks. It's just so easy. Just click it. Just make it a habit before you turn the ignition on or push the button. Now it's push button start. Most vehicles just do that. But the other thing with that is so important is that as adults, we can make that decision to buckle up. But with our children and our young children in the car seats and booster seats, talk a little bit about car seats and booster seats, what the law requires. And one of the things that I see, a lot, I feel like goes on a lot is that children aren't in seats when they're still supposed to be required to based upon height and weight requirement. And number 2, I feel like that they're not properly in the seat, meaning the straps or buckles are too loose, Trooper Summerville, or, you've got the anchors and people don't have the seats locked down enough. So they're really not getting the full benefit of being in the seat. Talk a little bit about both those things for us.
One of the questions I get more as a state trooper when people, often talk about the number of crashes, as state troopers, that's kind of our main element is working car crashes. And I always get this question, how do you guys go home and deal with what you see every day in terms of some of the crashes? And certainly some of them are very, in terms of trauma to the person's body involved. It's a lot to look at for a human being. And as a human being, we really should look at some of the stuff we as state troopers see. And I always tell folks, not that we don't have sympathy for the people that's involved or compassion for them, but it gets to be a part of our job and we try to do their job as we are trained to do that. But I tell them the only time that it really gets me, and in my career I've had the unfortunate case of doing this, is working a car crash where a child has been killed. That sticks with me for a day or two, or a week or two. I just can't seem to get that out of my mind. And you're right, because as an adult, you have a choice. But you got to make choices for your children, because sometimes children either won't put them on or they'll get out of them, or sometimes children don't want them on, and just the parent not wanting to hear that child fuss and cry about it just won't make them put it on. And so oftentimes children are killed, and that really bothers me as a trooper. I think it bothers every trooper to see a child, because that's not normal to see a child killed in a car crash simply because they don't have a seatbelt. And oftentimes the parents are very apologetic at the end of the day, but you want to tell them, ma'am, you don't want to really get on to them at that moment because they just lost a child. But somewhere in talking to them, you want to make them realize, don't do this again. You see what has happened. We want you to go out and educate other parents not to make the choices you made in terms of not putting that seatbelt on. Now, let me give you some rules and regulations or the law concerning a seatbelt. Okay. Once a child is born, from an infant to a year old, that child has to remain in a rear-facing car seat. Once the child turns a year old, the child from a year old to 5 years old, he can be in a federally approved forward-facing car seat. Now, at 6 years old, the child can be in a booster seat, whether it's a high-back booster or just a regular boosted seat. And at 7 years old, certainly if the child is big enough, you can go ahead and the seatbelt fits him properly. At 7 years old, that child can be in just a seatbelt. Now, you notice I never mentioned anything about height and weight, because you always get the height and weight. The height and weight standards come from the car manufacturer or the car seat manufacturers themselves. In law enforcement, we strictly go by the child's age. However, I will say this in terms of what the car seat says, because it does come from a safety factor from the manufacturer. If you have a child, let's say, from a year old, you're supposed to be rear facing. Well, if you have an 11-month-old child who's a pretty big 11-month-old child, and he is not securely fitting in that car seat, if it's rear facing, well, based on what the car seat says at a certain weight or certain height, if he meet those standards, then that he could be forward facing. Well, at that point he could be forward facing, because the car seat regulates that in terms of what their safety standards are for. So at that point, that is at the discretion of the parent to make that choice at that point.
Well, and I think it's so important, folks. And like I said, I just see it so we're in such a hurry a lot of times when we get in a car, we're in a rush, we're late leaving, or we're worried about traffic and this, that, and the other, and you got your kids, and you just kind of throw them into the car seat, and they're not strapped in tight enough. Just make sure that they're buckled in. That they're buckled in, they're in the appropriate seat for their age and size and weight, and that you've got the seats properly strapped in. The other thing that you touched on earlier that I think is so important here is what they see. They're going to emulate what they see, and they're going to get into a habit. And so if you start that child, if all they know when they get into a car, when they get old enough to 1.5, 2 years old, they can start almost buckling the seat themselves, and you check it behind them, that becomes a habit for them.
Mm-hmm.
It's so important that they won't get in a car. There won't be one of that 15% that you're talking about that don't buckle up when they get older to be 16, because it's a habit. They don't get in the car without being buckled up.
Mm-hmm. And that's a good thing. And then when you look at children, not only will they make it a habit, and you're right, we're creatures of habit. They will remind the parent that they don't have theirs on, so they'll let you know that you need to put your seatbelt on. And you can make it fun, make it a game, make it something that the children like, that type of activity. And so oftentimes again, I have parents all the time tell me their children remind them to put their seatbelt on. And let me go back a little bit when you talked about in terms of children being safe in their car seat. So often parents, because they're afraid that they may be hurting the child, sometimes the child is not actually put in the seatbelt properly. That seatbelt has to be on, or the car seat, I should say, that harness that goes over the child needs to be where it's tight enough. You don't want to have it too tight that you're restricting the child, but you should have it tight enough where you can fit 2 fingers in there. And I know it feels a little bit tight, but you need to tighten it up a little bit. You would be surprised when I talk about the dynamics of a vehicle, vehicles in motion. There's so much energy going on inside that vehicle. When there's so much energy going on inside that vehicle, if you don't have it set right, that child could actually be thrown out of that car seat. I've seen it happen before where the parents say, well, the child was buckled in, but they didn't have him buckled in properly. So you need to buckle that child in properly. Sometimes, parents, just to make it easy, they may put the car seat around, say, a booster seat. Well, they have the lap portion around the child, but the harness may be behind the child's back, because you see parents driving like that sometimes. I don't like it over my shoulder, so I put the shoulder harness behind my back, and I just have the lap portion. Well, if you have that for a child and you're involved in a crash, that child becomes a human projectile at that point. And if they're riding in the back seat and you hit something, your body has a tendency to go in the direction of the crash, or the impact of that vehicle. So if you run into, a tree, that child's going to come flying out of that car seat and go straight towards the tree that you just hit, because they were not properly secured in that child restraint. So definitely put them in properly. You're not hurting the child. You definitely need to put it in with just a little bit tight on them.
Yeah, I agree totally. And a couple other things that I'll mention there that I've seen in doing some stories and information on this. One, especially like for today, last couple of days where we've had really cold weather. Just be careful about, if you've got a heavy coat, you really don't want to put a child in the car seat with a heavy coat, because you really have more than that 2 fingers that Trooper Summerville was talking about. And if you're not sure, folks, we have, I think, Huntsville Hospital Women's and Children, the fire stations. If you're not quite sure how to properly put the seat in the vehicle and how the child should be seated in the vehicle strapped in, then they're certified car seat fitters and places in and around your community.
Yes. That
can probably help you do that. They don't charge you anything to do that, I don't believe. If it is, it's nominal for a small donation or something, but well worth the education that you get there. The only other thing I would mention that comes up in my field that I wanted to mention with car seats that I think is important is that if you're ever involved in a motor vehicle crash, no matter how minor, even if a child is not involved in the crash, if there is a seat in the crash, a booster seat or a car seat, most experts would recommend you replace that car seat. Just because there could be some microscopic flaw now in the seat that next time you need to make a panic stop or there is a wreck, the seat may not function as properly. So just parents out there, if the car's involved in an accident and there's a car seat in there, most automobile insurance carriers will replace that as a part of the damage to the vehicle, the property damage. So just keep that in mind, folks. As we wrap up, Trooper Summerville, is there anything else that you see? Is there 1 or 2 other tips for parents, or anything else that you see that there are primary causes of accidents that you would say when you go out and speak to teenagers and groups that you want to focus on? We hadn't hit on you here before we wrap up.
Well, we got to talk about the big one, Mo, and that big one is, of course, drinking and driving. We need the summer months are coming up. People are going to be traveling. We want you to go out and have a good time, enjoy yourself at the beaches or wherever you may be going. But keep in mind, if you're going to get behind the wheel of that vehicle and you've had something to drink, you need to get you a designated driver at that point. Now, and I always talk about getting a designated driver. If you're going to a bar or some activity where there's drinking involved, you said, well, I'm going to be the designated driver, but I'm only going to have a couple of drinks, guys. So if you've had a couple of drinks, you're not the designated driver. You need to get someone else. And I always talk about a plan. Have a plan in place before you go somewhere. You know, if you're 3 or 4 or 5 buddies or something, you're going out, you know, if you're going out every weekend or whatever you may be doing, you know, change weekend. Well, this weekend will be Jim's weekend. This weekend will be Greg's weekend, whoever. And somebody be that designated driver every weekend. And, you know, oftentimes I talk to children. I had an interesting thing. Something happened to me a little while back. I went to Jacksonville State University for a career fair, and I saw a gentleman in there that I had come to his high school before. He remembered me from coming to his high school, and he, you know, this is something that's really proud to me. He told me that I literally changed his life when it comes to drinking and driving and wearing a seatbelt. He told me he had been there. He told me he was in a fraternity, and he said when his fraternity threw parties, he would always make sure after the parties were over that he designated he and some of his other fraternity brothers to make sure everybody made it home safely. If they were drinking, even if they had to use their own vehicles, they got people home. They also made sure that everybody put their seatbelts on. He told me, Trooper Summerville, I want to thank you because before you came to my high school, I never really thought much about that. And he admitted that, you know, I was that one that would go out and drink with my buddies and get behind the wheel of a vehicle, and I wouldn't put my seatbelt on because as a teenager, I just never really thought about it. He said, until you came to that school and showed us some videos of what could happen if you don't put your seatbelt on. So certainly that was something that I was really, really proud of. That's why I think it's so important. And I appreciate Aaliyah, my supervisors in this organizations to allow us to take the time to go into schools and talk to kids, because I definitely think it makes a difference. Since I've been on the education side of things, I do know education is so important because we can reach so many kids. You know, oftentimes I go talk to just here coming up now with prom week. I got to do several promise programs. I'm going to be talking to an auditorium full of juniors and seniors that are about to go to the prom, and I think definitely if I can talk to these kids and kind of change their behavior, as you said, that attitude or that behavior, that habit before they get behind the wheel, I think that can, you know, enforcement is good, and we need enforcement, but I think I can educate so many more people than I can actually go out and write a ticket to. So I think it has a bigger impact because oftentimes, you know, not that ticketing doesn't work, because it does work, writing tickets, but oftentimes people will just try to figure out a way next time not to get that ticket in terms of beating that ticket. But when you put someone and you educate someone, that kind of comes back to it, like the young man I was talking about at Jacksonville State. You know, I educated him, and it came back to him that this is what I need to do. So we definitely appreciate Aaliyah allowing us as state troopers to actually go into schools and definitely get this message out.
Well, it's so important, and it's funny because coming full circle here, we were talking earlier at the beginning of the conversation about how technology can be a hindrance sometimes with distracted driving and texting driving. But here, this is a way with preventing drinking and driving. Technology can be helpful, and I know that in some communities it may not be as prevalent. Where you grew up and where I grew up, there's not a whole lot of Ubers and Lyfts in Eutaw and in Carrollton and Aliceville. Yes. But if you're in a major metropolitan area, which is where probably a lot of the drinking and driving is going on because there's more bars and more restaurants for it to occur, it's so easy, folks, just to get the Uber or Lyft app and push a button and somebody will come pick you up. And even I think a lot of times people think, well, I got my car here. Maybe they drove sober to where they're going, but they don't want to leave their car. You can take an Uber there. Somebody can drop you back off the next day. But it's so easy. I just got back from a trip from a big city, and we used Uber everywhere we went. It was so convenient in doing it. I didn't have to worry about anything else. Just pop, there's a person with a car that's safe and drives me from A to B, and it's very, very efficient. So remember to use technology if you can, certainly designate a driver. Those are things there. And again, coming back full circle, folks, if you drink and drive, if you go to a restaurant and you have one too many beers and your kids are in the car and they see that, they're going to think that's acceptable behavior.
Yes. Yes, and I'm so glad you brought that up, Mo, because I wanted to say that before we close, because oftentimes kids will do that. And let me say this to parents. We were 16 at one time. If you don't believe your children are drinking, just ask a law enforcement officer because they're out there drinking. It doesn't mean they're bad kids. As I say, we were 16, and sometimes at 16, you take risks because the brain is not fully developed. Again, it does not mean they're a bad child. I go to schools oftentimes, and I'll ask children, raise your hand if you had a beer before. Raise your hand if you had a drink a little bit stronger than a beer. And needless to say, most of them will raise their hand and say they've had it before. And I ask, do your parents know? And most of them say no. And their parents don't know they drank or don't believe they drank. So they are drinking, and sometimes they will tell me, and I'm happy they do tell me. So talk to your children also about drinking and driving. They may not be getting it from you. They may be getting it from a older brother, older friend, or just their buddies are getting it from somewhere. But believe me, children are drinking. And that's also along with the pills. You know, children are taking, we have an opioid crisis now. So children are partaking in these type activities. So as parents, please talk to your children. Please monitor your children. Sometimes it's just something as simple as talking, holding a conversation. We're so busy with the hustle and bustle of what's going on. Every time we get here, our children are in the room playing video games or doing whatever. We really don't take the time to talk to our children. So, you know, sit down maybe over a Sunday dinner, if you have Sunday dinner, and just open up to your children and kind of ask what's going on. You know, what are you doing? What have you been up to? And just kind of talk about when you were a teenager, some of the choices, decisions that you made that weren't so good. So now they feel, okay, mom and dad made a mistake when they were 16 too. So maybe I can talk about this a little bit to them. So just talk about children, that to your children rather. But I will say this, not all children are, because there are a lot of children that don't drink, but there are quite a few that do drink. And so get out and talk to them if you have some suspicion of who they might be hanging with, who their buddies, who their friends are. If their buddies and friends are doing it, then there's a great possibility that they may be doing it also. So just watch where they're doing it and basically who they're hanging out with.
That's a great point, and to kind of piggyback on that is even if they're not drinking, make sure that they're making good decisions to not get in a car with another person who is drinking. Maybe they weren't drinking, but maybe they were at a party and somebody's drinking and they get in the car. Make sure they have enough confidence to pick up the phone and call you, mom and dad, that you're not going to feel like they're going to be belittled or in trouble for making the smart decision. Maybe they were somewhere not where they were supposed to be, but they didn't take it to the next step to get into a car with someone who was under the influence of drugs or alcohol. So as we close out here, I assume part of your job as the public information education officer should go out and speak to students and speak to groups and educate, as we've been talking about for the last 40 minutes. How do people get in touch with you if they want to get you to come speak to a group or an organization?
Well, you can certainly call the state trooper's office or any state trooper's office for that matter. It doesn't have to be if you live in another area, just whatever your local state trooper's office is, just give them a call and just tell them to put you in touch with us. Of course, the number here locally, it's of course area code 256-533-4202. That's the number to the local state trooper's office for the Huntsville, Decatur, and Gaston area, because we do cover DeKalb County and Etowah County also. So you can get in touch with that way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Trooper Summerville, thank you so much for your service again to our state and to our country and the Guard, and we appreciate your time today and what you're doing to try to keep our roads and highways safer. Folks, thanks for tuning in. And again, please like and share the show. There's a lot of great information shared here today that I think can benefit a lot of people and prevent a lot of crashes and a lot of injuries. Thank you again, Trooper Summerville.
Thank you.